What's the first sign a kid has terrible parents? Story 1. In second grade, there was a kid in our class named Joey who never seemed to have his act together. One day, during show and tell, he brought in a potato. Not a decorated potato, not a potato carved into something cool, just a regular old potato. When the teacher asked him to explain, Joey said, "It's my pet. His name's Spud." We all laughed, but he was dead serious. "Spud listens to me better than my dad does," he added. The teacher froze for a second before saying, "That's creative, Joey." Turns out Joey had been feeding Spud parts of his lunch because, as he explained, Spud's always hungry, and he doesn't yell if I spill something. Honestly, the potato was probably getting more nutrition than Joey was. The real kicker? A week later, Joey's dad showed up to pick him up, and, no joke, he was holding another potato. I guess the family has a theme. Story 2. I'll never forget the kid from my fourth grade class, Kyle, who would barter like a Wall Street trader at lunch. One day, he was going table to table trying to trade his single slice of white bread for literally anything. "I'll give you this premium slice of bread for a fruit roll-up," he offered. No one bit. He upped the ante, throwing in a ketchup packet he'd swiped from the cafeteria. When someone finally asked why he only had bread and ketchup, Kyle shrugged and said, "Mom says we're out of food, but I think she just forgot to go shopping again." We all sat there stunned while Kyle happily squirted the ketchup onto his bread and said, "This is gourmet now." The next day, he brought mustard. Kid was basically living on condiment sandwiches and vibes. Story 3. There was a girl in my middle school band class named Rebecca who never seemed to have the right supplies. One day she showed up without her flute. When the band director asked her where it was, she said, "Oh, it's in the pawn shop." Everyone laughed, thinking it was a joke, but she followed up with, "Yeah, my dad said we needed gas money." The room went silent for a second before Rebecca just shrugged and added, "I'm playing the triangle today." And she did. She crushed that triangle part like it was a solo at Carnegie Hall. Later we found out her dad had also pawned her older brother's skateboard and their microwave. Honestly, Rebecca was a legend. I think she could have turned anything into a band instrument if she had to. Story 4. At summer camp one year, there was this kid, Travis, who never stopped eating marshmallows. Like he'd hoard them from s'mores night, stuffing them into his pillowcase and sneaking them during quiet hours. When the counselors asked why he was so obsessed, he said, "Mom doesn't let me eat fun food at home because it's bad for my teeth. But she smokes inside, so I think her priorities are a little off." The counselors tried to keep a straight face, but it was game over when Travis whipped out a graham cracker from his sock and said, "She's not here now, so I'm living my best life." By the end of the week, his cabin smelled like burnt sugar, and he had single-handedly depleted the camp's marshmallow supply. Story 5. In fifth grade, my friend Sam always wore the weirdest clothes. One day, he came to school wearing a sweater that said, "World's Best Grandpa." Naturally, we asked him where he got it, and he just shrugged and said, "It's my dad's. He buys all his clothes at Goodwill, and he says I can wear whatever fits." Another time, he showed up in a shirt advertising a seafood restaurant in Florida. We lived in Ohio. When someone teased him about it, Sam grinned and said, "At least I'm not wearing the lobster bib he bought, too." Honestly, Sam's wardrobe became a running joke, but the kid owned it. One time, he told the teacher his mismatched socks were artsy and that he was starting a trend. She believed him. By the end of the year, half the class was rocking mismatched socks, and Sam was basically a fashion icon. Story 6. Growing up, I had a classmate named Jake. He was that kid everyone whispered about, always disheveled, the faint smell of mildew clinging to his clothes and perpetually exhausted as if he carried the weight of the world on his small shoulders. But what really stood out was how he latched on to anyone who showed him kindness. It wasn't in the normal way a kid might look up to a teacher or older student. He'd act as if a friendly smile meant a new best friend, an extended hand meant a lifeline, and he'd start sharing things no child should ever even think about. One day during recess, Jake told me that he sometimes stayed at school as long as possible to avoid going home. "Home's where everything bad happens," he said, with the kind of resignation that didn't belong in a 10-year-old's voice. He spoke of a father who was either raging or absent, and a mother who was so wrapped up in her own survival that she barely noticed Jake at all. It explained a lot. Why he always ate as if he hadn't seen a meal in days, why he flinched at loud voices, and why he clung so tightly to any scrap of warmth. It wasn't until our teacher caught him crying over a broken crayon that things came to light. Jake thought he'd get punished for wasting supplies. His words. I remember the teacher crouching down to his level, her face filled with that heartbreaking mix of pity and anger. Anger not at Jake, but at whatever cruel reality had taught him to be this way. She hugged him tightly, breaking every unwritten rule about professional boundaries, and whispered, "You're safe here." Jake's story unraveled over weeks of hushed conversations and shared glances between staff. A few adults made reports, but nothing seemed to change at home. For the rest of the year, though, our teacher made it her mission to protect him. She'd keep snacks in her desk for Jake, let him stay after school for extra projects, and always reminded him that mistakes didn't make him bad. I think she knew that in a world that had failed him so profoundly, her classroom was one of the few places he could just be a kid. By the end of the school year, Jake moved away, and we lost touch. But every now and then I think about him and hope that somewhere down the line he found people who made him feel safe and loved, because every child deserves that, every single one. Story 7. I used to work at a daycare, and there was this one little boy, Evan, who stuck out immediately. On my first day, he ran up to me, arms outstretched, yelling, "Take me home!" At first I thought it was cute. Kids say weird things, right? But every single day he did the same thing. He hugged any adult who walked in, clinging to them like he'd known them forever. He'd sit by the front door when pickup time came, staring longingly at parents walking in, only to wilt when they passed him by. One afternoon I crouched down next to him and asked why he always wanted to leave. He shrugged and said, "It's just better anywhere else." That hit me like a truck. Later, during an incident where Evan fell off the jungle gym and scraped his knee, I noticed something even more alarming. He flinched so violently when I raised my hand to pass him a tissue that he almost fell again. The other teachers exchanged looks, and I realized they'd noticed too. We all suspected something wasn't right at home, but what could we do? I reported my concerns, but nothing seemed to happen. Evan's behavior didn't improve. He stopped asking people to take him home, but only because he stopped talking much at all. I still think about him and wonder what kind of life he's living now. I just hope someone, somewhere, has given him the love he so clearly needed. Story 8. In 5th grade, there was this girl named Melanie who sat at the back of the classroom. She was one of those kids you almost didn't notice. Quiet, always staring out the window, her hair hanging limp and unwashed. But I'll never forget the day she got an answer wrong during a math quiz. She muttered, "I'm so stupid," under her breath, so softly I almost didn't catch it, except she didn't stop there. "I'm useless. Mom's right." I froze in my seat, unsure if I'd heard correctly. Our teacher gently corrected her, saying, "You're not stupid, Melanie. Everyone makes mistakes." But Melanie didn't even lift her head. She just nodded, her face blank. After class, I overheard her quietly apologizing to our teacher for wasting her time. That's when I started noticing the little things. She never brought a lunch and claimed she wasn't hungry. Her clothes were always slightly too small, her shoes worn thin, and she never talked about her family, unless it was about how mad her mom would get if she didn't get an A. By the end of the year, Melanie's grades started slipping, and her blank stares grew longer. I heard years later that she dropped out of high school. I still wonder what might have happened if just one adult had truly listened to her. Story 9. When I was 16, I worked at a summer camp, and there was this kid, Trevor, who always showed up in the same filthy hoodie no matter how hot it got. Trevor was sweet, but something about him felt off. He'd laugh too hard at little jokes and follow every counselor around like a shadow. One night during a campfire, he blurted out, "You're the nicest person I've ever met," to a counselor who had simply handed him a marshmallow. Everyone chuckled awkwardly, but Trevor looked so earnest it was heartbreaking. Later that week, he asked me if I thought he was too dumb to be liked. I assured him that wasn't true, but his face fell and he said, "That's what Dad says." My stomach twisted. Over the weeks, I noticed him flinch at loud noises and avoid eye contact with older male staff. He told me once that he loved camp because it was quiet and nobody gets mad over spilled juice. After camp ended, I didn't see Trevor again, but I hope that little escape gave him at least some peace, even if just for a summer. Story 10. When I was a freshman in high school, I noticed this girl in my biology class, Jenna, who always seemed like she was walking on eggshells. She'd come in every day with her shoulders hunched, keeping her head down and barely saying a word. One time, during a group project, I accidentally dropped a textbook on the table, and Jenna flinched so violently that she knocked over her water bottle. She apologized over and over, her face turning bright red. I tried to tell her it was no big deal, but she kept muttering, I'm sorry," like she thought I'd yell at her. After that, I started paying more attention to her. She never participated in class discussions unless the teacher called on her, and even then her answers were quiet and hesitant, like she was afraid of being wrong. One day, while we were paired up for an experiment, she told me she couldn't stay after school to finish because her dad didn't like her coming home late. I joked that my parents were the same, and she gave me this strange, forced laugh. Then she said, "Yeah, but my dad, he gets really mad. It's just easier not to upset him." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Over the next few weeks, she started opening up a little more, sharing small glimpses of her home life. Her dad would yell at her for the tiniest things, forgetting to put a dish away, getting an A instead of an A. One time she said, "I wish I could just disappear sometimes. It'd make things easier." That stuck with me. I wanted to tell someone, but I didn't know who or how. It wasn't like there were bruises or anything you could see, but the way she shrank into herself every time someone raised their voice made it clear something was wrong. By the end of the year, Jenna stopped coming to school regularly. She'd miss weeks at a time, and when she did show up, she looked thinner and more tired than ever. Our teacher tried reaching out, but Jenna just said she'd been sick. The last time I saw her was during finals. She was sitting outside the counselor's office, staring at the floor with this defeated look on her face. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know how to help. After that, she transferred schools, and no one really knew what happened to her. To this day, I still wonder if there was more I could have done. I didn't understand it fully then, but now I know. Jenna wasn't just shy or quiet. She was surviving. And no kid should have to live like that. Story 11. Growing up, I had a neighbor, Mrs. Jones, who was a sweet old lady always baking cookies for the kids in the neighborhood. But one day her grandson Caleb moved in with her. He was this skinny little guy, maybe 6 or 7, who looked like he hadn't slept in years. The first time I met him, he stared at the ground the entire time, muttering, "Sorry," even though he hadn't done anything. He'd spend hours outside with no shoes, even when it was cold, and would flinch so badly whenever a car backfired that you'd think someone had hit him. Mrs. Jones confided in my mom one day that Caleb had been removed from his parents' home. She didn't go into details, but she said, "That boy's seen too much." Caleb started clinging to my mom, following her around whenever she was gardening. He'd help pull weeds and ask questions like, "Do moms always yell?" Or, "Do dads love you even if you're bad?" My mom would answer as best as she could, but I could see the heartbreak on her face. Caleb only stayed for a few months before moving again. I often wonder where he ended up, and if he ever found the safe, loving home he so desperately needed. Story 12. When I was in middle school, there was this kid, Andy, who sat at my lunch table. He wasn't a friend, really, but more like someone who just drifted from group to group. One day we were joking about how strict our parents could be. I said something dumb like, "My mom grounded me for not cleaning my room." and everyone laughed. But then Andy chimed in quietly, "At least your mom talks to you when she's mad." The table went silent. Andy looked embarrassed and quickly changed the subject, but after that, I started paying more attention to him. He always came to school with these heavy bags under his eyes and would scarf down his lunch like he hadn't eaten in days. Once, during a group project, he rolled up his sleeve, and I noticed faint, irregular bruises on his arm. He caught me staring and mumbled, "It's nothing. I'm just clumsy." But it wasn't just clumsiness. He'd jump whenever someone slammed a locker too hard and freeze if anyone raised their voice. At the end of the year, he disappeared from school. I found out later that he'd been removed from his home after a teacher reported something. I never saw Andy again, but I think about him whenever I see a kid trying too hard to fade into the background. Story 13. In 4th grade, I had a classmate named Sarah, who was always volunteering to stay after school to help the teacher clean up. At first, everyone thought she was just a teacher's pet, but then it started getting weird. She'd beg to help with the most mundane things, like organizing papers or sharpening pencils, just to avoid going home. One day, our teacher gently told her she didn't need help, and Sarah burst into tears. She kept saying, "Please don't make me go home," over and over. The teacher hugged her and said, "You're safe here." I didn't know what that meant at the time, but I remember Sarah missing school for a few days after that. When she came back, she was quieter than ever, her eyes red and puffy like she'd been crying all night. She stopped volunteering to stay late, and her usual spark was gone. I asked her once why she didn't stay after school anymore, and she just shrugged and said, "It doesn't matter. No one notices me anyway." Years later, I heard through the grapevine that Sarah's home life had been a mess, neglect, abuse, the works. It hit me like a ton of bricks, realizing all those little signs we'd missed as kids. Story 14. Back in elementary school, there was this kid named Marcus who was known for being the troublemaker. Teachers were constantly scolding him for interrupting class, getting into fights, or not following the rules. Everyone just assumed he was a bad kid, but I never really saw it that way. Sure, he acted out, but there was something about the way he did it that felt off. It wasn't like he was trying to be mean or hurt anyone. It was almost like he wanted attention, any attention, so badly that he didn't care if it was good or bad. One day during recess, Marcus got into a fight with another boy over a basketball. The teacher broke it up and sent Marcus to sit by himself on the bench. I was sitting nearby and heard him muttering to himself, "I'm just bad. Nobody likes me anyway." That stuck with me. Later, during lunch, I saw him sitting alone, picking at his food. I decided to sit with him, and we started talking. He told me his mom was always too busy to help him with his homework, and his dad was never around unless he was mad. He said his older brother was the smart one, so no one cared what Marcus did, as long as he stayed out of the way. "At least when I get in trouble, they notice me," he said with a sad laugh. After that, I started seeing Marcus differently. His anger wasn't just anger, it was hurt. He didn't know how to ask for help, so he acted out instead. I told my mom about him, and she encouraged me to invite him over to play sometime. When I did, he looked so shocked and happy that I almost cried. We spent the afternoon playing video games, and for the first time I saw him smile without that guarded look he usually had. Unfortunately, that was one of the few times we hung out. His family moved away not long after, and I never heard from him again. I often think about Marcus and wonder if anyone ever gave him the attention he so desperately needed. Kids like him aren't bad, they're just broken in ways the world doesn't always take the time to fix. Story 15. In middle school, there was this kid in my class named Lily. She was always impeccably dressed, her hair neat, and her smile polite but distant. Everyone assumed she had it all together, but every now and then I'd catch glimpses of something different, like how she'd tense up whenever the teacher asked if her parents could chaperone a field trip, or how she always had an excuse for why she couldn't invite anyone over. One day, during a group project, someone accidentally knocked over a water bottle, spilling it across the table. Lily froze. Her eyes widened and she immediately started apologizing, even though it wasn't her fault. She grabbed paper towels and cleaned up the mess, mumbling, "Sorry, sorry," the whole time. I told her it was fine, but she just nodded and kept scrubbing like her life depended on it. Later, I asked her why she got so worked up about the spill. She hesitated, then said, "At home, mistakes aren't allowed. My dad says mistakes mean you're not trying hard enough." Her voice was so matter-of-fact, like this was just the way the world worked. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. Over time, Lily started confiding in me more. She told me her dad was strict, which I later realized was her way of saying controlling. Everything in her life had to be perfect. Her grades, her behavior, even the way she folded her laundry. "If I mess up, he yells," she said once. Sometimes he doesn't stop for a long time. By the time we graduated, Lily had become a master at hiding her emotions. She smiled when she was supposed to, said all the right things, and never let anyone see the cracks in her perfect facade. I lost touch with her after high school, but every so often I wonder how she's doing. Did she ever break free from that pressure? Does she finally feel like it's okay to make mistakes? I hope so. Everyone deserves to feel like they're enough, just as they are. Story 16. I'll never forget the time I babysat for a family down the street. Their son, Danny, was about 8, and he was the sweetest kid. Polite, funny, and always eager to help. But something felt off. Whenever I asked him if he wanted to watch TV or play games, he'd immediately say, "Whatever you want," as if his own opinion didn't matter. One night, while tucking him in, I accidentally bumped the lamp, and he flinched so hard he nearly fell off the bed. I laughed nervously and said, "Whoa, buddy, it's just me." But he looked at me with these wide, scared eyes and whispered, "I thought I was going to get hit." My heart broke in that moment. I asked him why he'd think that, and he said, "Sometimes when I mess up, Dad says I need to learn." I tried not to cry as I told him he didn't deserve to be hurt no matter what. I reported it to my mom, who called CPS, but nothing seemed to change. The next time I babysat, Danny was quieter than usual, and when I asked how he was doing, he just said, "I don't talk about home anymore." I never babysat for them again, but I've never stopped worrying about Danny. Story 17. In high school, I had a part-time job at a coffee shop where one of the regulars, a teenager named Kayla, would come in almost every day after school. She'd sit in the corner with her homework and nurse the same hot chocolate for hours. One day, I asked her why she hung out there so much, and she gave me this half-smile and said, "It's just quieter here." Over time, we started talking more, and I learned bits and pieces about her life. Her mom was always working late or out with her boyfriend, and her dad wasn't in the picture. Kayla practically raised herself and her little brother, cooking, cleaning, and making sure he got to school on time. One evening, as I was wiping tables, she casually mentioned that she hadn't eaten all day because her mom had forgotten to buy groceries again. I offered her a sandwich on the house, and she looked like she might cry. "Thanks," she said, "but I'm used to it." Kayla eventually stopped coming to the coffee shop, and I've always wondered what became of her. I just hope she finally found someone who made her feel cared for the way she deserved.